Today I want to tell you about Maggie. Maggie Kuhn. Maggie was born in 1905 in Buffalo, New York. Her parents had moved up from the South just before her birth. They were trying to escape some of the racism and all the trouble that was going on in the South in the early 20th century. And they moved north. Now, even in the north, you couldn't escape all of that, but it was at least a little bit less. And so, as many people moved up through the early part of that century, moved up from the South, her family was part of that. Now, Maggie ended up in her college years at a place called Case Western Reserve University in Ohio. Now, it was interesting, I guess, as you could say, interesting enough that in the mid-1920s, a woman went to college at all, but especially a place like Case Western Reserve, which was and still is known for engineering and science and things like that. So she was fairly active in college, and she organized one of the first chapters of something called the League of Women Voters. Why was it one of the first chapters? Well, women only were voting for a few years at that point, after securing the right to vote in 1920. So she was an active and activist type person. After college, she worked at the YWCA, the counterpart to the YMCA. This was the Young Women's Christian Association. So not only was she an activist, but it also had a piece of her faith wound into it. So much so that after the YWCA, she went to work for a long time for the Presbyterian Church. That was her church of her past and her present. She went to work for the Presbyterians in New York City. Back then, and really throughout most of the 20th century, the large denominations all had offices in Manhattan. And so she was not only immersed in the national tradition of her Presbyterian church, but so many others. And while she was there, she worked for essentially their social justice department. And she also was an editor for their denominational magazine. We have the Lutheran and now the Living Lutheran magazine. Well, most of the denominations also had a magazine, and she worked for them. And she worked for the Presbyterian Church for most of her adult life. And then something happened. Something she didn't expect. Well, she sort of expected it. She turned 65. That part you can mostly anticipate. What she didn't expect was that the church would enforce its policy of mandatory retirement at 65. Maggie thought she was just getting started. She enjoyed her work. She enjoyed her life. She enjoyed being able to mix her faith and her desire to live as Jesus had called her to do, and her desire to work for and on behalf of people who needed the church, who needed the message of Jesus. But they retired her nonetheless. Now, we take for granted these days that people have much more life after 65. We take for granted that at retirement, many people pick up something new, pick up a hobby or go to work or volunteer or do something more. In Maggie's time, it just wasn't the case. The news media, the popular television shows and the like, often portrayed older people, elderly people as, well, out to pasture. They didn't have a whole lot to offer, and frankly, most of us were just waiting for them to pass. But not Maggie. She turned her thoughts, her mind, her action. She turned her life into something new. And she founded an organization that brought young people and older people together to have conversation about how the world might be better. How the older people might instruct the younger folks in things that worked from their experience, that the younger folks might instruct and inform the older people about what was new and what was changing. This energized her. It energized her to the point where she got the group so organized that they got a name. Well, we're given a name. Some of you may remember this organization. They called them the Gray Panthers. Kind of a play on words from the Black Panthers of the late 60s, the African American activist organization. Well, her organization got the name the Gray Panthers, and she didn't stray from it. She said, all right. Later on, she wrote her first book about her experience with the Gray Panthers and this intergenerational dialogue. She wrote her first book at age 69. So if you've got a book in you, it's not too late. That was her first book. She wrote another when she was, I think, 71 or 72. When she died in 1995 in Philadelphia, some people noticed. Most of the world didn't. Her footprint wasn't as big as Gandhi or Martin Luther King or even some of the suffragettes of her early life, Susan B. Anthony and the like. But Maggie made a difference. And the difference that she made speaks to our lessons today. In Habakkuk, it talks about vision. And you know, sometimes we want things to change so much we can't wait. Whether it's in our own lives or in the country or whatever it is that's affecting us, sometimes we're so eager we say, God or the legislature or our teachers or our parents, whoever it might be, come on, let's change now. But God reminds us in Habakkuk to be patient. And in this world, when so much is at our fingertips in an instant, being patient and waiting for the vision to come takes time. You might say that for Maggie, the real work of her life didn't start until her late 60s. And that's how it works sometimes. A second thing from Paul's letter that arrives from Maggie's life is that Paul reminds us, guard those things that matter. Guard those things that you've been given. And Maggie Kuhn certainly did that. She was a person who was raised in the faith, carried on the faith, but more importantly, said, older people can act and can be advocates for themselves. Older people can have conversations with younger people. Women can write books and make change. And she guarded that and defended it and protected it for a next generation. And finally, from the gospel lesson, and I want to read it so I get it right. We have done only what we ought to have done. We often think that church, that activism or activist work or whatever we want to call it when we talk about making changes, we often get tired because maybe the vision doesn't come as soon as we want. Or maybe guarding and defending those things just is exhausting. Or maybe it just feels like work. And Maggie Kuhn's life reminds us that what we care about doesn't have to be work. It doesn't have to be seen as a misery If it is, maybe we need to look for different work. But that notion of doing what we ought to do. There's a really common phrase these days, and it's especially said to young people, which I think is a terrible pressure that you should never have to deal with. And that is the idea that you're going to change the world. You're not. Sorry. Not because you're not capable, but because it takes typically more than one person to make a huge change. Maggie did change the world in some ways, but she wasn't the only one. The people that came up alongside of her, the people that helped her, that we don't even know about, were part of that change. So it's important for us to remember that we can only do what we ought to do. We can only do what we can do, and that's enough. But when we partner, when we get together, as Maggie tried to do with younger folks and older folks, when we put those things together, then we've got a shot at making some real difference. But that's not just her work, it's our work. I want to show you a quick video from a project that we're just getting started on here at Trinity. Okay? Go ahead.
It's time to bridge the gap.
It's time to bridge the gap
between the old and the new,
the past and the present,
the young and the not quite as young. By simply looking at one another, we naturally cast some sort of judgment. We can never fully understand one another without conversation.
How are we different?
How are we the same?
Where have our judgments failed us?
Life is proposing we close the gap.
Let's open up the conversations. It's time to bridge the gap.
Who will you choose to talk to first?
Maggie Kuhn's work is still alive, and it's still necessary for the church. It's still necessary for our work in the world, and it's something that we ought to do. And the video is a beginning for us to sort of break down some of the assumptions and stereotypes and start to talk with one another. Start to say, hey, we've been around a while. We've got something to offer. Aside from just, hey, could you help us program our phones? And likewise, you guys have something to offer. You can share with folks who are older what's happening in the world, things that are new, things that have changed, other than just, how old are you? People live that long? And somewhere in the middle are your parents. But skip us and go to the older folks. This is really a holy calling, as Paul says and as Jesus says. But it's also a holy opportunity for us to learn from each other, not just for the church's sake, but for the world's sake. We're kind of in some messes right now in our world, whether it's the environment or politics or whatever it might be. You guys have seen some other messes and can remind us we'll be all right. And you guys have the energy and the hope and the vision to get it fixed. So the last thing is, I was reminded after the first service of why this is so important and why Jesus went to the cross for us. I had two little girls among the other kids at the altar today for the children's message. And we talked a little, and they went to Sunday school, and that was the end of that. And then when I ran downstairs for a second to get something to drink between services, both of them ran up to me, and one said, "I made you a bracelet." And the other said, "I made you a necklace." If that isn't reason enough for us to connect with each other, I feel like I need to guard the world that they're inheriting. If that isn't enough to remind us that there's still good in the world, there is still hope in the world, and little kids still care about an old man like me. If that isn't enough, I don't know what is. We'll bridge that gap together. Amen.